The Meridian hung in the dark between three suns like a chandelier that had forgotten. It was also a fortress. It had been built 10,000 years earlier as a place where enemies could stand in the same room without reaching for their weapons. And in all that time, it had never once succeeded in making anyone forget the weapons entirely. Its great hall was a hollow pearl a kilometer across, ringed with tiers of stone that had been carried there from 100 dead worlds, and at its center floated the Table of Concord, a ring of polished basalt around which the fate of civilizations had been argued for longer than most of those civilizations had existed. On the morning the peace conference opened, that hall held 11,000 delegates, and not one of them expected the humans to matter. They had, in fairness, been invited. The invitation was a matter of record, sealed with the eightfold cipher of the Assembly of Concord, and transmitted to the small blue world at the edge of the Orion Spur, along with a note that could be politely summarized as a formality and impolitely summarized as an afterthought. Humanity had been a probationary member of the Assembly for 11 years. Probationary members were entitled to observe. They were not, as a rule, entitled to be remembered. So the human delegation had been given seats. The seats were in the 9th tier, which was as far from the Table of Concord as it was possible to sit and still be considered inside the hall at all. To reach them, one climbed past the delegations of the great powers, past the middle powers, past the client states and the trade combines and the ceremonial observers from species so ancient they no longer bothered to speak, up and up until the basalt ring below shrank to the size of a coin. From the 9th tier, the two warring empires whose century-long war this conference existed to end were indistinguishable smudges of color, and the arbiter who would broker the peace was a pale mote at the center of everything. Tamsin Vey sat in the 9th tier with a stylus in her hand and a data slate on her knee, and she was, at 25, the youngest person in the human delegation by a decade and the youngest person in the hall by rather more. Her official title was junior attaché for records, which meant that her job was to write down what happened, not to interpret it, not to advise on it, and certainly not to influence it. To write it down. When the human delegation returned home, there would be a transcript, and Tamsin would have made it, and that was the entire shape of what the galaxy expected of her. She had been chosen for the role because she was cheap to send, because she took excellent notes, and because someone in the ministry had decided that the youngest linguist on the roster could not possibly cause any trouble at an event this important. The someone in the ministry had never watched Tamsin Vey listen. She was listening now. That was the thing about her that people missed, and they missed it because she was small and quiet and had a face that resolved at rest into an expression of mild and unthreatening attention. What they did not see was that the mild attention never switched off. Tamsin had learned 9 languages before she was 15, not because she was a prodigy, though she was, but because she had grown up in a household where silence was rare and meaning was slippery, and she had discovered early that the person who understood the room controlled the room, even if no one ever noticed her doing it. She had turned that into a discipline, and then a career, and now she sat in the highest, farthest, most forgettable seat in the great hall of the Meridian, and she was understanding the room. Beside her, Ambassador Daniela Reyes leaned over and murmured, "Try not to look so interested. It makes them nervous." "They can't see us from here," Tamsin murmured back. "They can see that a human is paying attention. It's the principle." Reyes was 50, silver at the temples, and had spent 20 years in rooms where humanity was the smallest thing present. She had learned to survive those rooms by making herself smaller still, by smiling, by being unfailingly gracious and utterly unmemorable, and she had kept humanity alive in the assembly through 11 years of probation by never, ever giving anyone a reason to look twice. "We are here to be seen agreeing," she said. "We nod when the great powers speak. We do not speak ourselves. And in 4 days we go home having proven that humans can attend a conference without embarrassing anyone, That is the win, Tamsin. That is the entire win. Yes, Ambassador. You don't believe me. I believe you completely, Tamsin said, which was true, and did not add that believing Reyes and agreeing with her were different activities, which was also true. Below them the conference began. It began, as these things did, with sound. A single tone from a resonator older than the human species rolled up through the tiers, and 11,000 delegates fell silent in the layered, complicated way that a crowd falls silent when its silence has diplomatic weight. Then the arbiter rose. His name was Kale Vessin, and he was concordant, one of the neutral old species whose entire civilization had reorganized itself, millennia ago, around the profession of standing between other people's wars. The concordant were tall and gray and fluid, with faces that suggested candle wax caught in the moment before it fell, and they were bred and trained, and some said chemically adjusted from birth toward a single trait, the appearance of perfect impartiality. Vessin had brokered 9 treaties. He had never, it was said, taken a side in his life. When he spoke, his voice was amplified through the hall's ancient acoustics until it seemed to come from the stone itself. For 103 years, he said, the vascular ascendancy and the Threll compact have made war. He let that sit. 103 years, 3 human lifetimes. In the second tier a block of color shifted, the vascular, tall and chitinous and gleaming, a warrior people whose bodies were their own armor and whose history was a single unbroken line of honorable violence. Across the ring from them, a rustle of silk and glass. The Threll, ancient and mercantile and beautiful, a species that had conquered half a spiral arm without ever, quite, being seen to hold a weapon. Between these two, the war had burned for a century, across 900 worlds, and had killed a number of thinking beings that the Assembly's own statisticians had stopped publishing, because the number had stopped meaning anything. Both peoples are weary, Vessin said. Both peoples have bled, and both peoples have at last consented to end it, not with a victory, with a peace. He raised his long gray hands. In 3 days, if the conquered holds, the representatives of the vascular ascendancy and the Threll compact will set their seals to the Treaty of the Meridian, and the longest war of our age will be over. The Assembly has invited you here to witness, to bear the weight of it, so that when it is done, no one may say it was done in shadow. Applause was not the concordant way. Instead, the hall hummed, 11,000 voices producing, each in their own register, the low tone of assent, so that the pearl of stone filled with a sound like a struck bell that would not stop ringing. Tamsin felt it in her teeth. It was, she had to admit, magnificent. It was designed to be magnificent. Everything about the Meridian was designed to make the beings inside it feel that they were part of something too large to resist, and that resistance, therefore, would be not merely futile but faintly obscene. She wrote it all down, and while she wrote, she listened, and while she listened, she noticed the first thing. It was small. It was so small that later, when she tried to explain it to Reyes, the ambassador would look at her with the particular patience of a woman deciding whether her junior attaché was brilliant or simply overtired. But Tamsin noticed it, and once she had noticed it, she could not stop noticing it, the way a single wrong note pulls the ear back across an entire symphony. The Threll delegation had a leader. His name was High Factor Eilage Marn, and he was, by every account Tamsin had read, the most gifted negotiator the compact had produced in 300 years. He had spent a decade constructing this peace. He had shuttled between the empires, absorbing insult and offering none, and he had drafted, personally, the treaty that 11,000 delegates had traveled across the galaxy to watch him deliver. When Vessin finished, Marn rose to speak, and he spoke in trade concordant, the common tongue of the Assembly, in a voice like water over smooth stones. He spoke beautifully. He spoke of grief and of reconciliation, of the children of both empires who had known nothing but war, of the sacred exhaustion that made peace possible where reason never could. He was, Tamsin thought, genuinely one of the finest speakers she had ever heard in any language, and she had heard a great many. And then halfway through, he turned to his own delegation, a small movement, a courtesy, acknowledging his aids, and he said 4 words in the private cant of the Threll High Houses. The private cant was not trade concordant. It was not, in fact, a language the Threll taught to outsiders at all. It was a nested, elusive register of their own tongue, used among the mercantile aristocracy, dense with reference and impossible to learn without a lifetime inside their culture. No non-Threll spoke it. That was the point of it. The Compact had used it for 10,000 years precisely, because it was a language they could speak in a crowded room and be certain no stranger understood. Marn said 4 words in it quietly to his second, a Threll named Osel who stood at his shoulder. And then he turned back to the hall and resumed his beautiful speech about grief and reconciliation without a pause. The 4 words were, "Hold the old wording." Tamsin's stylus did not stop moving. Her face did not change. She had spent 4 years, in the quiet hours no one paid her for, teaching herself the private cant of the Threll High Houses from a single corrupted archive that had come into the human ministry's possession during a trade dispute, cross-referencing it against every scrap of intercepted Threll aristocratic correspondence humanity had ever collected, building the grammar out of fragments the way a paleontologist builds a beast out of 9 bones and a great deal of nerve. She had done it because it was hard, and because no one had told her not to, and because her old teacher, Professor Adami, had once said that the languages people believe are private are the only languages worth learning. Nobody knew she could do it. It was not in her file. It was not, strictly, a thing she was supposed to be able to do at all. Hold the old wording. It meant nothing. It could mean nothing. A stray instruction, a housekeeping note between an aristocrat and his aide. And yet Marn had chosen to say it in the one register at the table that he was certain no outsider could parse, in the middle of a speech about transparency, at the exact moment he was assuring 11,000 witnesses that this piece would be done in the light. Tamsin wrote down the 4 words. She wrote them in the human phonetic script small in the margin of her transcript where the ambassador would not see them. And then she went on taking notes, mild and quiet and unthreatening, the youngest person in the hall in the highest and farthest seat, watching the most gifted negotiator in 300 years and beginning, very slowly, very carefully, to wonder what the old wording was. The first session ran for 6 hours. It was, by the standards of galactic diplomacy, a blur of astonishing speed, because the hard work had all been done in advance. Marn had spent 10 years doing it. What remained was ceremony. The 2 empires would ratify the treaty's framework today. They would resolve the 3 outstanding annexes over the next 2 days. And on the 3rd day they would sign, and Kale Vessin would seal the whole edifice with the authority of the assembly, and it would become one of the fundamental facts of the galaxy, as fixed and unarguable as gravity. The framework was read aloud in full. It was long. Most of the delegates stopped listening after the first hour, and Tamsin could not entirely blame them because most of it was exactly what it appeared to be, a genuine, careful, humane instrument for ending a war, prisoner exchanges, reparations, balanced with great delicacy so that neither empire could claim to have paid tribute, reconstruction funds. A demilitarized cordon along the old front, 900 worlds wide, to be monitored by the assembly in perpetuity. And at the heart of it, the clause on which everything else depended, mutual demilitarization. Both empires would stand down their war fleets. Both would submit to inspection. Both would beat their terrible swords into the machinery of ordinary life, and the balance between them would be preserved not by terror but by law. It was a good treaty. That was what unsettled Tamsin most, as the hours wore on and the 9th tier grew cold around her. It was a genuinely good treaty, and the man who had written it was, by every measure she could apply, a great man doing a great thing. And yet, in the private tongue of his own house, he had told his aide to hold the old wording. "You've gone very quiet," Ray said, as the session finally closed and the tiers began to empty, 11,000 delegates flowing toward the hall's 40 gates in a slow tide of color. "Even for you." "I'm tired," Tamsin said. "It's a lot of writing." Ray studied her for a moment. She was not a stupid woman. She was, in fact, one of the shrewdest people Tamsin had ever worked for, and something in Tamsin's stillness had registered. But she had spent 20 years learning not to go looking for trouble, and the habit held. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we do it again. Nod when the Vaskier speak. Nod when the Threll speak. Say nothing, sign nothing, want nothing." She stood, smoothing the plain gray of her coat. Humanity's delegation wore no jewels, no color, nothing to draw the eye, because Rays had decided long ago that the safest thing a human could be in this galaxy was boring. "In 3 days we go home, Tamsin, having attended the most important piece in a century, and having been of absolutely no importance to it whatsoever. That is the plan. That is a good plan. Do you understand me?" "I understand you completely," Tamsin said. And she did. She understood the ambassador completely. She simply had, folded small in the margin of her transcript, 4 words in a language she was not supposed to know, and a growing, cold, precise conviction that the most important piece in a century was about to be built on a lie, and that she was, at this moment, the only person in a hall of 11,000 who had any idea. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the narrow bunk of the human delegation's quarters. The Meridian had given them rooms near the docking spine, as far from the great hall as the 9th tier was from the table of Concord, which was its own kind of message. And she opened the treaty framework on her slate, and she began to read it the way she read everything, which was slowly and twice, and in every language at once. The treaty existed in 3 official versions. This was standard. A treaty between 2 empires that did not share a tongue was always rendered in the languages of both signatories, plus a neutral third, trade concordant, the common speech, which served as the master text, the version that would be taken as authoritative if the 2 empire language versions ever disagreed. Except that this treaty had a 4th version. Tamsin found it in the annexes, in the section on ratification and binding, where no one but a records clerk would ever look. The treaty's binding oath, the sacred formula that the 2 empires would speak aloud at the signing, the words that would make the whole thing real, was not to be rendered in trade concordant at all. It was to be spoken, by ancient assembly tradition, in old concordant, the dead ceremonial language of the arbiters, the tongue in which every treaty of the Meridian had been sealed for 10,000 years, spoken now by no living people, understood in full by perhaps a few hundred scholars in the entire galaxy, and treated by everyone else as a beautiful, empty, ritual sound. Hold the old wording. Tamsin Vey sat very still in the dark, in the narrowest bunk on the least important corridor of the Meridian, and she began, word by word, in a language 10,000 years dead, to read the oath that would end the longest war of the age. And somewhere around the 3rd line, she stopped breathing because she had found it, and it was worse than she had let herself imagine. The oath was a masterpiece. Tamsin would grant it that, in the same way one might grant a knife its edge while it was going into someone. It ran, in the dead ceremonial tongue, to 11 lines, and to any of the few hundred scholars alive who could still parse old concordant it would have read exactly as it was meant to read, a solemn, symmetrical, achingly beautiful mutual pledge. Both empires would speak it, each in their turn. Both would swear the same words, and the words swore that each signatory would render its instruments of war unto rest. That was the phrase, render its instruments of war unto rest. It was the pivot of the entire treaty, the sacred heart of the demilitarization clause, the thing that made 103 years of slaughter stop. In trade concordant, the master text rendered it plainly. Each empire shall permanently disarm its war fleets, subject to inspection. There was no ambiguity in the master text. There was no ambiguity in the Vaskier version or the Threll version. All three said in three languages the same clean thing: disarm permanently and be inspected. But the binding oath, the one spoken aloud, the one that by 10,000-year tradition overrode all written versions the instant it left the signatories' mouths, was in Old Concordant. And in Old Concordant, the verb at the center of render, its instruments of war unto rest, was a word that Tamsin had spent an hour confirming against three separate lexical reconstructions, because she could not, at first, believe that a man as careful as Marn would rest the fate of the galaxy on a single conjugation. The verb was sethanu. In Old Concordant, sethanu had two forms, and they were separated by a mark so small that in 10,000 years of ceremonial use, no one had ever bothered to distinguish them aloud, because no one had ever needed to. In its completive aspect, sethanu meant to lay down forever, to disarm in the permanent, irreversible sense the master text demanded. In its durative aspect, marked only by the faintest lengthening of the central vowel, sethanu meant to lay down for a season, to set aside, to rest as a soldier rests between campaigns, with the full and sacred expectation of taking up again. The oath, as written in the annex, used the durative. Both empires would speak the oath, but the oath was a spoken thing, and the two empires did not pronounce Old Concordant the same way. The Vaskir, a literal and honorable people, had learned their ceremonial concordant from assembly tutors 1,000 years ago, and pronounced every syllable exactly as written, which meant that when the Vaskir spoke the oath, they would speak the durative, unknowing, and it would not matter, because the Vaskir intended to disarm and would go on disarming forever, faithful to the plain meaning of the master text they had signed. But the durative spoken aloud, bound only to its plain durative sense, and by the oldest law of the Meridian, the spoken oath governed the written treaty. So when the Vaskir spoke the durative and disarmed forever, they would be overperforming their oath, giving more than they had sworn, and no one would ever know or care. And when the Threll spoke it, the Threll had never learned Old Concordant from assembly tutors. The Threll had their own ancient scholarship, their own unbroken lineage of ceremonial pronunciation, and in the Threll mouth the central vowel of sethanu was long. It had always been long. It was long in every Threll temple and every Threll court and every Threll recording in the archive Tamsin had spent 4 years assembling. The Threll would speak the oath, and it would sound, to 11,000 witnesses, identical to the Vaskir oath. But it would not be identical. The Threll would be swearing the durative in its true durative sense, to set the fleets aside for a season, with the sacred and lawful expectation of taking them up again. They would sign a treaty promising permanent disarmament. They would submit to inspection. They would, for a year or 5 or 10, stand their fleets down with perfect visible good faith. And then on a morning of their choosing they would take them up again, and when the assembly cried betrayal, the Threll would produce the binding oath, the true text, the spoken text, the text that governed all others, and they would demonstrate before the law of the Meridian itself that they had never sworn to disarm forever. They had sworn only to rest, and they had rested. And now they were done resting. By then the Vaskir would be defenseless, genuinely, permanently, honorably defenseless, disarmed forever by their own faithful overperformance of an oath they never understood. And the Threll, who had absorbed 100 years of a war they could not win by force, would win it in an afternoon, without firing a shot, having conquered the strongest military power in the spiral arm with a single lengthened vowel in a language everyone had agreed to stop understanding 10,000 years ago. Hold the old wording. Tamsin set the slate down on her knees. Her hands, she noticed with distant interest, were not quite steady. Outside the narrow window the 3 sons of the Meridian wheeled slowly in the black, and somewhere below her 11,000 delegates slept, or did whatever their species did in the dark, secure in the knowledge that in 3 days the longest war of the age would end. And it would end. That was the terrible elegance of it. The war would end, and the peace would be real, and it would hold for exactly as long as the thrall wanted it to hold. And then it would become the greatest bloodless conquest in the history of thinking life. And the instrument of that conquest would be the single most admired peace treaty of the century, signed and sealed and blessed by an assembly that would have staked its 10,000-year honor on the beauty of the thing. She thought about waking Rays. She got as far as standing up. Then she sat back down, because she could already hear the conversation. She would say, "The binding oath uses the durative aspect of Sethanu," and Rays would say, "The what?" and Tamsin would say, "It's a mark on a vowel in a dead language," and Rays, shrewd, careful, exhausted Rays, who had kept humanity alive in this assembly for 11 years by never once being the person who said something impossible. Rays would look at her with terrible gentleness and ask how a junior attaché for records had come to be an authority on the ceremonial pronunciation of a tongue that had been dead for 100 centuries. And Tamsin would have to explain that she had taught herself the private cant of the Threll High houses in her spare time from a corrupted archive, and reconstructed the vowel lengths of old concordant from temple recordings. And that on the basis of these unauthorized and undocumented and frankly bizarre private studies, she was now accusing the most respected negotiator in the galaxy of engineering the fraud of the millennium. And Rays would be right to hesitate. That was the thing Tamsin made herself sit with alone in the dark. Rays would be right, because Tamsin had no proof. She had a reading. She had a conjugation and a conviction, and 4 words overheard in a language she wasn't supposed to know. And if she took that to the ambassador, the best case was that Rays believed her and did not know what to do with it. And the worst case, the far more likely case, was that Rays, doing her sworn duty to protect a probationary species from catastrophic embarrassment, quietly confiscated the slate and sent Tamsin home on the next transport, and spent the rest of the conference praying no one had noticed the human girl who'd been staring too hard. Tamsin needed more than a reading. She needed the kind of proof that did not depend on anyone taking her word for anything. She began that night to hunt for it. She did not sleep at all. When the Meridian's slow, artificial dawn came up gray in the narrow window, she was still bent over the slate, and she had found 2 more things, and each one had made the floor feel a little less solid beneath her. The first was in the treaty's certification record. Every official translation lodged with the assembly had to be certified as equivalent by the Master of Rolls, the assembly's chief archivist, the being whose entire function was to swear that the versions of a treaty in different languages said the same thing. The Master of Rolls for the Treaty of the Meridian was a concordant named Sethan Olivar, and Olivar had certified all 4 versions, including the old concordant oath, as equivalent in meaning, which was either an error of scholarship so vast as to be impossible in a professional archivist, or it was not an error at all. Tamsin pulled Olivar's certification history. In 40 years of service, the archivist had never once certified a text with a disputed aspectual reading without flagging it. Never. It was, apparently, a point of professional pride. And here, on the single most important text of the archivist's career, the flag was simply absent, as though the durative Sethanu were the most ordinary thing in the world. Someone had reached the Master of Rolls. Tamsin did not know how or with what, but she knew what a clean certification on a fraudulent text meant, and it meant that the fraud was not Marnes alone. It had a second author inside the assembly itself. The second thing she found was worse, because it was aimed at her. She had gone looking near dawn for the corrupted Threll archive she'd learned the private cant from, the source of everything, the 4 years of quiet work that were the only reason she'd understood hold the old wording at all. It lived on a secure partition of the human ministry's network, and she wanted to confirm a single grammatical form. When she reached for it, it was gone. Not deleted. Tamsin knew what deleted looked like. Restricted. Reclassified, within the last 30 hours, under a ministry code she'd never seen applied to a linguistic archive, with an access lock that required an authority 2 grades above her own. Someone, somewhere, in the same window in which this conference had opened, had decided that a junior attaché's obscure collection of Threll aristocratic correspondence was suddenly a matter of the highest sensitivity. Which meant that someone already knew. Not that Tamsin had figured it out. She'd told no one, done nothing, sat quiet in the 9th tier and taken her notes. But someone knew that the archive existed, and that a human had it, and that a human who had it might, conceivably, one day, read something she wasn't meant to read. And that someone had moved to make sure she couldn't. They had been a few hours too late. Tamsin had already read it. But the lock told her something more important than any grammar. She was not the only one who understood how dangerous a single overheard sentence could be. The people who had built this fraud had thought about every angle of it, including the angle where an outsider learned a language they weren't supposed to learn. They had war-gamed her. She was a contingency in someone's plan, a box that had been ticked, and the tick meant that the moment she opened her mouth, she would be walking into a trap that had been set for her specifically, months before she'd known there was a trap to walk into. She looked at that for a long time in the gray light. And then, because she was 25, and because Professor Adami had also once said that the only unforgivable thing was to understand a room and do nothing, she did something that would have given Ambassador Reyes a stroke. She started to plan. The second session opened 3 hours later. Tamsin took her seat in the 9th tier with her slate and her stylus and her mild, unthreatening face, and if she had not slept, no one in a hall of 11,000 was close enough to see it. Reyes glanced at her once, said, "You look terrible," and then, satisfied that this was merely the ordinary toll of 6 hours of transcription, returned her attention to the floor. The floor today belonged to the annexes. The framework had been ratified. Now the 2 empires would resolve the 3 outstanding details and move toward the signing. Tamsin watched high-factor Marn descend to the table of Concord and take his place, water over stones, and she watched the vascular delegation across the ring. And for the first time she looked at them not as a smudge of chitinous color, but as people who were, at this moment, being led with exquisite courtesy toward their own annihilation. Their leader was a vascular named Legate Soon Kor. Tamsin had read the file. Kor was old for a vascular, which meant scarred in ways that showed. One of the great chitin plates of the legate's shoulder had been shattered and regrown in a paler shade, a wound from a battle 40 years gone that Kor had apparently declined, on principle, to have cosmetically corrected. The vascular did not hide their history. It was written on their bodies, and they carried it upright, and everything in the way Legate Kor stood at the table of Concord said that here was a person who had spent a century at war, who had lost more than Tamsin could imagine, and who had come to this hall to end it because ending it was the honorable thing, and the honorable thing was, to a vascular, the only thing. They were going to disarm forever. They were going to speak an oath they didn't fully understand, overperform it out of sheer literal faithfulness, and hand the Threll 100 worlds without a fight. And the reason it would work, the reason it was going to work, was precisely that the vascular were honorable. Marn had built his fraud on the one thing about his enemy he could absolutely rely on, that when a vascular swore an oath, the vascular would keep it to the letter forever, no matter the cost. He had turned their honor into the blade. That, more than the vowel, more than the suborned archivist, was the thing that made Tamsin cold all the way through. It was not enough for Marn to be clever. He had needed his enemy to be good. At the mid-session recess, Tamsin did the second reckless thing. The delegates dispersed into the concourse that ringed the great hall, a vast curving gallery where species that had been trying to kill each other for a century now stood in careful clusters drinking things and saying nothing that mattered. Reyes went to nod at the middle powers. Tamsin, who was supposed to stay within sight of the delegation at all times, did not. She drifted, slate under her arm, mild and quiet and beneath notice, along the edge of the concourse, until she found herself standing not far from the Threll. The high factor was surrounded. But his second, the aide he had spoken those 4 words to Ocel, stood a little apart near a viewport, holding a glass of something that caught the light of the 3 suns. Ocel was younger than Marn, Tamsin thought, though it was hard to be sure with the threll. There was something in the set of the aide that read, to her over-attentive eye, as ambition not yet fully rewarded. A clever second who wanted to be a first. She stopped a polite distance away, as if she too had merely come to look at the suns, and she said nothing. She had learned long ago that the fastest way to make someone speak to you was to very obviously not want them to. It took Ocel about a minute. "You are the human," Ocel said, in trade concordant without turning. "The one who writes." "I write," Tamsin agreed. "It must be restful," said Ocel, "to have nothing to do at a conference but record what your betters decide." The threll turned then and looked at her fully, and the look was not unkind. It was worse than unkind, it was amused. "Do not take offense. It is a fine thing to be small. Small things survive what large things cannot. My own people were small once." Ocel sipped from the glass. "Enjoy the peace, human. It is the safest thing that will ever happen to your species. Nothing at all is being asked of you, and nothing at all is expected. There is a great freedom in being expected to do nothing." Tamsin smiled her mild smile and looked at the suns and said, in flawless, temple-perfect, aristocratic threll private cant, the 4 words, "Hold the old wording." Ocel did not drop the glass. Tamsin gave the aide that. The control was extraordinary. But something went out of the threll's posture, some assumption, some certainty, a load-bearing wall coming quietly down behind a face that stayed perfectly composed. And for one long moment the concourse of the Meridian held 2 people who understood exactly how much trouble they were both in, and 11,000 others who did not. "Enjoy the peace," Tamsin said pleasantly, in trade concordant, and walked away before Ocel could find anything at all to say, her heart going like a hammer, having just, quite deliberately, told the enemy that the smallest thing in the room could see them perfectly well. It was, Tamsin knew, an insane thing to have done. She spent the walk back to the human seats explaining it to herself, because some part of her wanted very badly to have a reason, and the reason she arrived at was this. She was going to be walking into a trap set for her no matter what she did, so she might as well choose which trap and when. If she'd stayed silent and quietly assembled her proof and struck at the signing, Marn's people would have had 3 days to notice her doing it, and every one of those days was a day for them to decide, at their leisure, that the human girl who kept staring at the annexes should suffer some quiet accident of scheduling that removed her from the hall. But if she went to Ocel and let them see, right now, that she understood everything, then she changed the game. Then they could not simply erase her because they no longer knew what she'd already done with what she knew. Had she told Rays? Had she sent word home? Had she lodged something with the assembly? A dead or discredited human, 3 days before the signing, was a manageable problem when she was a lone crank with a slate. It was a catastrophically unmanageable problem the instant Marn had to assume she might be the visible edge of something larger. Tamsin had no larger thing behind her. She had a slate, a stolen archive that was now locked away from her, and an ambassador who would faint. But Marn did not know that. And in the space between what Marn knew and what was true, Tamsin intended to build everything. She was, in other words, doing to Marn precisely what Marn was doing to the Vaskier, relying on the enemy's own excellence. Marn was too careful to gamble the conquest of the millennium on the hope that a human he couldn't fully assess was harmless. His care was her cover. As long as she looked like she might be dangerous, his own caution would keep her alive. It would not, however, keep her employed, because Ambassador Rays found out about the concourse within the hour. "Sit down," Rays said, in the human quarters, in a voice Tamsin had never heard her use. "Sit down and tell me what you said to the threll." Tamsin sat down, and then she did the thing she had decided, somewhere in the sleepless night, that she was going to have to do eventually, which was to trust the one person in the galaxy who had a duty to stop her. She told Ray's everything. The 4 words, the dead language oath, the vowel, the certification with the missing flag, the archive that had been locked 30 hours ago by someone above them both. She laid it out in order, cleanly, the way she laid out everything, and she watched the ambassador's face go from anger to disbelief to something much more frightening, which was calculation. Rays did not tell her she was overtired. That was the first thing that told Tamsin the ambassador believed her. Rays sat for a long moment, very still, and then she said quietly, "The archive lock. You're sure of the timing?" 30 hours. It was reclassified as the conference opened. By whom? The authority code is 2 grades above me. I can't read the signature, but it's ours, ambassador. It's a human hand. Somebody in the ministry locked that archive. And there it was, the thing Tamsin had not let herself say aloud in the dark, because saying it made it real. The fraud had a Threll author, and a concordant author inside the assembly. And now, it seemed, a human hand had reached across the whole width of the galaxy to make sure the one human capable of reading the fraud would not be able to reach her own evidence. Which meant that somewhere in humanity's own ministry, someone had been told what was coming, and had decided that humanity's interest lay in not noticing. "It's not treason," Ray said, watching Tamsin work it out. "That's what you're thinking, and it's not. Sit with it a moment and you'll see." She stood and moved to the narrow window and looked out at the wheeling suns. "Think about who wins this piece. Think 5 years out. The Threll conquer the Vaskier with a vowel, the Threll on the spiral arm. And the smart move, the survivor's move, for a small probationary species that wants to still be alive in 50 years, is to have been a good, quiet, useful friend to the Threll from the very beginning. Someone in the ministry didn't lock your archive to betray humanity, Tamsin. They locked it to protect humanity. They saw the shape of the future, and they decided we should be on the winning side of it. And being on the winning side means the human girl in the 9th tier keeps her mouth shut and lets the strong swallow the honorable, because the strong will remember who helped them digest." The room was very quiet. "That's what you're really deciding," Ray said, turning back. "Not whether Marn is a criminal, he is. Not whether the treaty is a fraud, it is. You're deciding whether we tell the truth in a room where the truth costs us the friendship of the people who are about to own everything, in order to save an empire that has never once, in 11 years, treated humanity as anything but furniture." She let that stand. "The Vaskier would not cross this hall to save us, Tamsin. You know that. If it were humanity being cheated, Legate Kor would take his notes and go home." "I know," Tamsin said. "Then why?" Tamsin thought about it. She was aware that the honest answer mattered, that Rays was not asking rhetorically, that the ambassador was giving her one genuine chance to talk herself out of the most dangerous thing either of them would ever do. And the honest answer, when she found it, surprised her a little with how simple it was. "Because if we let this happen," she said, "then the thing that wins is the idea that honor is a weakness you can farm. The Vaskier are going to disarm forever because they keep their word. Marn looked at the most reliable virtue his enemy has, and he figured out how to turn it into the knife. And if that works, if the galaxy watches that work and calls it the piece of the century and gives it a monument, then every honorable species in the dark just learned that the way to lose is to mean what you say. I'm not doing it for the Vaskier, ambassador. I don't much like the Vaskier. I'm doing it because I don't want to live in the galaxy that Marn's peace builds, where the only survivors are the ones who lie in a language nobody's allowed to learn." She looked up. "And because somebody taught me the language anyway." Rays looked at her for a long, long time. And then the ambassador, who had kept humanity alive for 11 years by never being the one who said something impossible, sat back down and put her hands flat on the table and said, "Then we are going to need a great deal more than a vowel." They had 2 days. What followed were the strangest 36 hours of Tamsin's life, and the most exhilarating, and she understood even while they were happening that she would spend the rest of her life measuring other work against them. Rays, it turned out, had been playing small for so long that she had forgotten, but not lost, how to play large. And once the ambassador had decided to do the impossible thing, she did it with a cold, methodical ferocity that made Tamsin revise every assumption she'd ever held about the boring woman in the gray coat. They built the case in 3 parts, because Rays said that a case with 1 part was a crank, and a case with 3 parts was a conclusion. The first part was the vowel, and here Tamsin was on solid ground, because a language could not lie about itself. She assembled the pronunciation record, temple recordings, Threll court archives, 3 independent scholarly reconstructions of Old Concordant, and the thing that would matter most, the Assembly's own certified audio of the last 4 treaties of the Meridian, in which the durative and completive forms of Sethanu could be heard, spoken by long-dead arbiters, distinct and unmistakable to anyone told where to listen. She could not unlock her stolen Threll archive, but she did not need it. Everything she needed to prove the vowel was in the Assembly's own public records, sitting in the light where no one had thought to look, because no one had thought there was anything to find. That was the beauty of it, and the horror. The proof of the fraud had been available to 11,000 delegates the entire time. It had simply required someone to care about a dead language enough to listen. Second part was the certification, the missing flag, the suborned master of rolls. This was harder because it required proving not a fact about a language but a fact about a person, and persons were slippery. But Rays had spent 20 years in the Assembly's corridors being underestimated, and it turned out that a woman everyone ignores accumulates over 2 decades, an enormous quantity of quietly observed favors, resentments, and debts. Rays made calls. She did not explain why. She asked an old contact in the registry, a mid-level concordant clerk who owed her a kindness from a trade dispute 11 years gone, for nothing more than Olivar's certification workload, a dull administrative record, the kind of thing no one guards. And in that workload was the tell. In the 90 days before certifying the Treaty of the Meridian, the Master of Rolls Olivar had certified 9 other, smaller instruments, all trade contracts, all lodged by minor compact-aligned houses, all approved with unusual speed. It proved nothing on its own. But laid beside the missing aspectual flag, it drew a line, faint but real, from the archivist's hand to the Threll purse, and a faint real line was all Tamsin needed, because she did not intend to prove the certification was corrupt. She intended only to make the Assembly need to find out, publicly, in front of everyone, which the Assembly could not survive doing quietly. The third part was the one that nearly killed the whole plan, because the third part was standing up. "We have no standing," Rays said, on the evening of the second day, and for the first time she sounded tired. "That's the wall, Tamsin. We can be right in every particular and it will not matter, because the floor of the Assembly belongs to signatories and mediators. Observers do not speak. Probationary observers most certainly do not speak. If I stand up at that signing and try to address the hall, Vessin will rule me out of order before I finish my first sentence, and he will be correct to do it. And 11,000 delegates will watch the human ambassador be gavelled into silence, and that image, is exactly what Marn wants. He wants us to try. A human shouting an inaudible warning and being escorted out is the best possible outcome for the fraud, because after that, anything we ever say is the raving of the species that embarrassed itself at the Meridian." She rubbed her eyes. "We need the floor, legitimately. And there is no legitimate way for us to have it." Tamsin had been waiting for this, because she had found the answer at some point during the second sleepless night and had been holding it, the way she held things, until it was needed. "There's one way," she said. Rays looked up. "I read the Assembly's procedural code," Tamsin said. "All of it. It's very long and mostly nobody's touched it in centuries, which is exactly why it's still full of things." She turned the slate around. There's a rule. It's 10,000 years old. It was written for the first treaty of the Meridian, and it's never been repealed because repealing dead rules is more trouble than ignoring them. It's called the witness's doubt. She let Rays read it. Any party present in the hall, any party ambassador, it says present, not signatory, not member, present, may, before a treaty is sealed, place upon the record a witness's doubt. A formal statement that the instrument before the assembly does not mean what it appears to mean. And the arbiter, once a doubt is placed, is required by the founding law of the Meridian to hear it in full before sealing anything. Not to agree with it, to hear it, publicly, on the record. Because the whole point of the Meridian, 10,000 years ago, was that no treaty could ever be sealed in shadow, and a treaty that a witness in the room believes is a lie is, until that witness is answered, a treaty being sealed in shadow. Rays read it twice. Tamsin watched her read it twice. They'll have repealed it, Rays said. Somewhere, in some annex, they'll have. They haven't. I checked every amendment for 10,000 years. It's dormant, not dead. It's never been invoked because for 10,000 years nobody's needed it, because for 10,000 years the arbiters were actually neutral, and the certifications were actually honest, and the treaties actually meant what they said. Tamsin's voice was very steady now. It exists precisely for the one time in 10,000 years when they're not. It exists for now. For a moment neither of them said anything. Outside, the three sons wheeled, indifferent. There's a cost, Rays said slowly. There's always a cost in the old rules. What does it cost to place a witness's doubt? And this was the part Tamsin had not wanted to reach because she had read the cost, and she had decided to invoke the rule anyway, and she had not yet told Rays what she had decided. The witness who places a doubt, she said, puts their own standing behind it. If the arbiter hears the doubt in full and rules it unfounded, if the doubt fails, the witness is expelled from the assembly. Not the delegation, the assembly. The species that placed a false doubt at the sealing of a peace forfeits its seat. She met the ambassador's eyes. If I'm wrong, ambassador, if I've misread one vowel in a dead language, humanity is expelled from the assembly of conquered. 11 years of probation gone. And no probationary species has ever been readmitted after expulsion. Ever. The silence this time was total. Ray stood and walked to the window, and stood with her back to Tamsin for a long time, looking at the sons. And Tamsin let her, because she understood exactly what she had just handed the ambassador. The entire future of the human species, in a spiral arm run by whoever won this peace, resting on the length of a single vowel that one sleepless 25-year-old at HFY claimed to have heard correctly in a language that had been dead for 100 centuries. Tell me you're sure, Ray said without turning. I can't, Tamsin said. I can tell you I've checked it 40 times. I can tell you the assembly's own recordings prove it. I can't tell you I'm sure because if I told you I was sure about something this size, you shouldn't trust me. I can tell you I'd stake my life on it. She paused. The rule makes me stake more than that. It makes me stake everyone's, and I still want to place the doubt. Rays turned around, and whatever she had been looking for in the sons, she seemed to have found it or given up looking because her face had changed. It had the boring, gracious, unmemorable calm Tamsin had watched her wear for 11 years, except that now Tamsin could see, underneath it, exactly how much iron it had always been hiding. Then we do it properly, the ambassador said. Not you, us. I'll place the doubt. It carries more weight from the head of delegation, and if it fails, it should fail on me, not on the youngest person in the hall. She held up a hand before Tamsin could argue. But you will speak it, because I don't know a single word of old concordant, and the one thing Marn will not survive is being answered, in front of 11,000 witnesses, by the smallest thing in the room, in the language he thought was his alone. Something almost like a smile crossed her face. He built his whole piece on the belief that no one was listening. Let's introduce him to the intern who was. They had 1 day left. And across the hall, in the Threll quarters, high-factor Eilish Marn had spent that same day doing his own arithmetic about the human girl who had spoken 4 words at a viewport, and he had reached his own conclusions, and he was not, unlike everyone else in the galaxy, making the mistake of thinking she did not matter. Marn made his move that night, and it was, Tamsin would later admit, exactly the move she would have made in his place, which was the most frightening thing about him. He did not send assassins. He did not lock more archives. He did something far cleverer. He made the human delegation an offer, and he made it in a way designed to destroy them whether they accepted it or refused. The offer came through Ocel, at the human quarters, an hour before the Meridian's artificial midnight. The Threll aide arrived alone, unarmed, holding nothing, and asked with perfect courtesy to speak with Ambassador Reyes. Reyes, who had been expecting something and had not known what, let Ocel in, and Tamsin sat in the corner with her slate and her mild face, and pretended to be furniture, which Ocel permitted, because it suited the Threll to pretend that the human girl was not the entire subject of the conversation. "The High Factor," Ocel said, "has been reflecting on the future of your species." "How kind of him," Reyes said. "He believes humanity has been underestimated." Ocel's eyes moved once to the corner where Tamsin sat, and away. "He believes that a people who can produce a scholar of such rare and unexpected gifts deserve a place at the true table, not the ninth tier. The Compact is prepared to sponsor humanity's advancement from probationary to full membership of the Assembly. Immediately. With Compact backing, it would pass in a single session. Your 11 years of waiting would end tomorrow." A pause, delicate as glass. "The Compact is also prepared to open its inner trade lanes to human shipping, and to place a standing order for human agricultural output that would, I am given to understand, transform the economy of your entire homeworld within a decade. All of this the High Factor offers freely as a gesture of respect between peoples who have, the faintest emphasis, understood one another." There it was. Tamsin did the arithmetic even as Ocel laid it out, and the arithmetic was beautiful and merciless. Full membership, trade lanes, the end of poverty at home, everything humanity had spent 11 years being too small to ask for, offered in a single sentence in exchange for nothing. In exchange, that is, for the one thing that could not be spoken aloud, that the human girl in the ninth tier would keep her mild face pointed at her slate and let the signing proceed. It was not a bribe because a bribe could be exposed. Nothing improper had been said. A generous elder power was elevating a promising young one, and if the young one happened, in gratitude, to have nothing to add to the sealing of the peace, why, that was simply the natural harmony of friends. And if they refused, if Reyes said no, then Marn would have his answer. He would know the humans intended to act, and he would have a full night to prepare, and worse, he would have on the record, in front of witnesses, a documented act of extraordinary Threll generosity toward humanity, immediately followed by a human attack on the Threll peace. He would be able to stand before the assembly and say, "We offered them the stars, and they answered with slander." The refusal itself became a weapon in his hand. Reyes understood all of it. Tamsin watched her understand it. And the ambassador, who had spent 11 years saying yes to smaller versions of exactly this, folded her hands and smiled her gracious smile and said, "Please tell the High Factor that humanity is deeply honored. We would be glad of full membership. We would be glad of the trade lanes. We accept his friendship with all our hearts." She let it land. "We look forward to the signing tomorrow and to a long and prosperous understanding between our peoples." Ocel's posture eased by a fraction. Tamsin saw it. The Threll had come to read the room and had read it as a surrender, and Ocel rose and made the gesture of parting and said, "The High Factor will be most pleased." He was, if I may, uncertain whether the wisdom of your people would match the talent of your scholars. "I am glad to carry him better news." "You may tell him," Reyes said, still smiling, "that our scholars serve our wisdom and never the reverse." It was, Tamsin thought, after Ocel had gone, a genuinely magnificent sentence, because it was completely true and Ocel had heard it as a courtesy. Reyes had just told the Threll exactly what humanity intended to do. in the plain speech of the assembly, and the thrall had smiled and thanked her for it, because Marn's people had made the same mistake everyone made, which was to assume that a thing this small saying a thing this direct could not possibly mean it. "We just accepted his offer," Tamsin said quietly. "We accepted nothing," Reyes said. The gracious calm was gone, underneath was the iron. "We expressed gratitude and looked forward to the signing. Every word was true. I did not promise him your silence, Tamsin, because he did not ask for it. He couldn't ask for it, not out loud. That was the whole architecture of the thing. He built an offer that only worked if we filled in the silence ourselves." She began, methodically, to gather her materials for the morning. "So we didn't fill it. We took the words and left the silence empty. Tomorrow we place the doubt, and Marn discovers that the empty silence was full the whole time." She paused and looked at Tamsin, and there was something almost fierce in it. "That's the trick they never see coming, the great ones. They're so busy building the trap in the space between what's said and what's meant that they never notice when someone simply declines to mean the thing they need you to mean. You did it to Ocel at the viewport. I just did it to Marn in my own quarters. It's the only weapon we have that they don't understand because they've never once had to survive by it. Now sleep. Tomorrow you speak a dead language to 11,000 people, and I would like you to be awake for it." Tamsin did not sleep, but she rested, which was different, and she went over the words until they were smoother in her mouth than her own name, and when the gray dawn came up she was ready. The signing was the grandest session of all. The great hall of the Meridian had been dressed overnight in the full ceremony of a sealed peace. The ancient resonators, the 10,000 years of accumulated ritual, the table of Concord laid with the physical instruments of the treaty, 4 versions on 4 scrolls of ceremonial fiber that would be archived forever as the founding record of the age. 11,000 delegates filled the tiers. The 3 suns aligned in the great viewport as they did once a year, on the day the Meridian had been consecrated, so that the whole pearl of stone filled with hard white light. Kale Vessing rose, gray and fluid and impartial, and Tamsin watched the arbiter and could not tell. She genuinely could not tell, and it unsettled her, whether Vessing knew. Whether the neutral old concordant at the center of everything was a fellow victim of the fraud or its final, necessary instrument. It did not matter in the end, for what she had to do. But she found she wanted to know, and she filed the wanting away, because there was work to do first. Marn descended to the table of Concord. Legate Soon Core descended from the vascular tier, the pale regrown chitin of the old wound catching the aligned light of the 3 suns, and the 2 leaders took their places on opposite sides of the basalt ring, and the hall hummed its low bell tone of assent, and Vessing spoke the opening of the sealing. "We are come to make an end of war," the arbiter said. "The instruments are before us, the witnesses are gathered. By the founding law of the Meridian, I ask now, before the seal is set, does any party present hold a doubt?" It was ritual. It had been ritual for 10,000 years, a formula spoken 1,000 times and answered every time with the silence that meant proceed. Vessing did not pause for it. The arbiter's gray hand was already moving toward the first scroll, the words "does any party present hold a doubt" still hanging in the white light as an ornament, a courtesy to a dead tradition, and 11,000 delegates were already leaning into the great moment of the sealing. Humanity holds a doubt. Ambassador Daniela Reyes was on her feet in the 9th tier, and her voice, which she had spent 20 years training to be quiet, she had for one morning trained to carry, and it carried. It rang up off the ancient stone and rolled down through the tiers and struck the table of Concord like a stone dropped into still water, and 11,000 delegates turned, as one body, to look at the highest and farthest and least important seat in the hall, where a woman in a plain gray coat stood alone. Vessing's hand stopped above the scroll. For a moment the arbiter did not move at all, and Tamsin, watching, understood that Vessing was doing arithmetic of a kind no arbiter had done in 10,000 years, searching a memory that spanned 9 treaties for what came next, for whether there was a next, for the shape of a rule so old it had passed out of living practice into legend. And then Vesen's gray face did something Tamsin had not seen it do in 3 days of perfect impartiality. It registered, for the briefest instant, something that was almost fear. The Vesen's amplified voice caught and steadied. The assembly does not recognize a right of doubt in a probationary observer. The head of the human delegation will resume her seat. This is a matter for signatories and I place the witness's doubt, Reyes said. Under the founding law of the Meridian, article of consecration, the 3rd clause unrepealed and in force. Any party present may place upon the record a doubt that the instrument does not mean what it appears to mean. I am present. I place it. And by the founding law that consecrated this hall, arbiter, you are required to hear it in full before you seal anything at all. The hum of the hall was gone. In its place was a silence Tamsin had never heard, the silence of 11,000 beings who had all, at the same instant, realized that they did not know the rules of their own oldest ritual as well as the woman in the 9th tier did. Down at the table of Concord, high-factor Eilish Marn had gone very still, and Tamsin, whose eyes were extraordinary and whose attention never switched off, saw the exact moment the great negotiator understood that his generosity of the night before had bought him nothing, and that the silence he had so carefully left empty had been full the whole time. Vesen consulted the founding law. It took the arbiter perhaps a minute, and it was the longest minute of Tamsin's life, and at the end of it the arbiter looked up, and Tamsin saw that Vesen had found the clause, and had found it unrepealed, and had understood that 10,000 years of tradition now required the neutral old concordant to do the one thing an arbiter most feared, which was to stop. The doubt is placed, Vesen said, and the words seemed to cost the arbiter something. The founding law is clear, the assembly will hear it. A pause. The human delegation will state its doubt, and the human delegation is warned. The gray voice hardened, and Tamsin heard in it the last defense of the thing that had been built, that a doubt found unfounded by this arbiter carries the forfeit of the assembly seat. A probationary species that places a false doubt at the sealing of a peace forfeits its place among us, and is not readmitted. Does the human delegation understand the price of what it does? It does, Reyes said. Then state your doubt, and be brief, and be right. Vesen's hand withdrew from the scroll and folded with its twin, and the arbiter sat, gray and rigid, and 11,000 delegates sat with the arbiter, and the great hall of the Meridian turned its full and terrible attention on the woman in the 9th tier who had stopped the peace of the century with 4 words. And Ambassador Daniela Reyes, head of the human delegation, said, I will not state it. Our doubt concerns the binding oath, which is written in Old Concordant, a language I do not speak. It would be an insult to this assembly for me to place before it a matter I cannot myself read, so the doubt will be spoken by the member of our delegation who can. She turned and looked at Tamsin, and the whole hall's attention swung with the turn, 11,000 pairs of eyes traveling up the tiers to land at last on the smallest thing in the room. Junior attaché Tamsin Vey, Reyes said, for records, who has read the instrument that the rest of us only signed. Tamsin stood. She was aware of everything with terrible clarity. The aligned white light of the 3 suns, the cold of the 9th tier, the pale regrown chitin of legate Corps' shoulder far below, the perfect stillness of high-factor Marn, the gray rigidity of the arbiter, the 11,000 delegates who had come to witness a peace, and were about to witness something none of them had a name for. She was 25 years old, and she had taught herself a dead language in the hours no one paid her for, and she was the youngest person in the hall by a decade and now the only person standing in it, and she was not, she found, afraid. She had been afraid in the dark, 3 nights ago, alone with the vowel. She was past afraid now. She was simply, at last, understood by the room, which was the only thing she had ever wanted, and the room was going to have to live with what it found. Arbiter, she said, and the ancient acoustics of the Meridian took her quiet voice and made it fill the pearl of stone. The doubt is this: the treaty before you promises, in 3 languages, that both empires shall permanently disarm. The master text says it plainly, but the binding oath, the words that will be spoken aloud in this hall, and that by the oldest law of the Meridian govern all the written versions the instant they are spoken, the binding oath is in Old Concordant. And in Old Concordant it does not say what the master text says. She let it land, one beat, the way Rays had taught her in the last gray hour. The oath uses the durative aspect of the verb sethanu, not the completive. It does not say lay down forever. It says lay down for a season. And I am prepared to demonstrate from this assembly's own certified recordings in front of every witness in this hall that the 2 empires will not be swearing the same oath at all. High Factor Marn rose. He did it slowly, with the grace that had carried him through a decade of impossible rooms, and when he spoke his voice was water over smooth stones, calm and warm and edged with the faintest, kindest regret. "Arbiter," he said, "I have spent 10 years of my life building this peace, and I have watched a great many people try to break it, and I confess I did not expect the last attempt to come from the tier of observers." A ripple of something moved through the hall, not quite laughter, but the cousin of it, the sound of 11,000 beings being invited to relax. I mean the young human no unkindness. She is plainly gifted. But she is asking this assembly to unmake the labor of a decade on the strength of her claim to hear a distinction, in a language dead for 100 centuries, that the master of rolls of this assembly, a scholar of 40 years standing, did not hear, that the arbiter did not hear, that no one in this hall has heard in 3 days of reading, save one probationary observer with a talent for languages, and I would gently suggest, a young person's hunger to matter. He spread his hands, the picture of reason. I do not doubt her sincerity, I doubt her ear, and I would ask the assembly to weigh one scholar's untested claim against the certified judgment of its own most senior archivist before it forfeits a century of peace to a vowel. It was, Tamsin thought, a superb answer. It conceded nothing, insulted no one, and reframed the entire question from "is the treaty a fraud" to "should we trust the intern?" It made her the story. It made the durative Sethanu a matter of her credibility rather than the treaties, and against a 40-year archivist she had none. Half the hall was already nodding. She could feel the moment tilting, the great weight of 11,000 beings' desire for the peace to be real sliding toward the man who was promising them it was. She had known he would say it. She had known, because Rays had made her sit in the gray hour and imagine the cleverest possible answer, and this was it, and Tamsin had prepared the one reply that Marn's excellence could not survive. "The High Factor is right," she said, "that you should not take my word for it." And the tilt stopped because that was not what anyone had expected her to say. "So don't. I did not come here to ask you to trust my ear, arbiter. I came here to let you hear it for yourselves." She raised her slate. "This assembly has kept certified audio of every treaty of the Meridian for 10,000 years. The recordings are public. I have done nothing to them. The arbiter's own clerks can pull the same files in the next 10 seconds and confirm they are untouched. In them, long-dead arbiters of this hall speak the verb sethanu in both its aspects, the durative and the completive, distinctly on the record, in the founding voice of the Meridian itself. I am going to play you 4. And then I am going to ask the vascular delegation to speak the oath as they have rehearsed it, and the threll delegation to speak the oath as they have rehearsed it, and I am going to ask this entire assembly, not me, you to tell me whether you hear the same word twice." She did not wait for permission. She played the first recording. The dead arbiter's voice filled the pearl of stone, 10,000 years old, speaking the completive sethanu, to lay down forever, the central vowel clipped and final. She played the second, the durative, the same verb, the vowel drawn long, to lay down for a season. She played them again, back to back, completive and durative, forever and for a season, and in the vast trained silence of the hall the difference that had been invisible on the page became, in the ancient acoustics, impossible to unhear. It was not subtle. It had only ever been invisible because no one had been told to listen. Now 11,000 beings were listening, and the difference rang off the stone like two different bells. Now, Tamsin said into the silence the oath, Legate Kor. You have rehearsed the words you will speak. Speak them. Speak Sethanu as your people say it. Legate Soon Kor looked up at the ninth tier for a long moment, and Tamsin could not read a vascular face, but she thought she saw, in the set of the old warrior, something arriving, some understanding of what was being asked and why. Kor spoke the oath verb in the literal assembly-tutored vascular pronunciation, every syllable exactly as written. The vowel was long, durative. To lay down for a season, though the vascular did not know it and meant forever and would perform forever, faithful past the letter of an oath they had never fully read. Thank you, Tamsin said quietly. That is the durative as written. The legate speaks the words honestly and means to keep them past their meaning as the vascular keep everything. She turned. High factor, the same oath, speak Sethanu as the thrall say it, as you will say it in an hour when you seal this peace. And here at last, Marn was trapped by the one thing he could not talk his way around, because a language cannot lie about itself and a man cannot pronounce a word two ways at once. If he spoke the completive, if he clipped the vowel to prove the treaty meant forever, then his own spoken oath by the oldest law of the Meridian would bind the thrall to permanent disarmament, and he would have conquered nothing. The fraud would collapse into an honest peace on the spot. And if he spoke the durative, the long vowel, as the thrall had always said it, as he had always meant to say it, then 11,000 delegates who had just, moments before, heard the difference between forever and for a season wrung off the ancient stone would hear him swear, aloud for a season, and know exactly what they were hearing. Marn understood it. Tamsin watched the great negotiator understand it in the aligned white light of the three suns, and she watched him do the arithmetic and find that for the first time in a decade there was no move on the board that did not lose. He could refuse to speak, and refusing to speak the oath, at the ceiling, with a doubt on the record, was itself an answer, the loudest answer of all. He was silent for 3 seconds. In a negotiation, 3 seconds is an eternity, and 11,000 delegates counted every one of them. This is theater, Marn said at last, and for the first time the water over stones had a rough place in it. A pronunciation game. The intended meaning of the treaty is plain in 3 languages. Then speak the fourth, Tamsin said. It's the only one that governs high factor. You wrote it that way. The binding oath overrides the written text the instant it's spoken. That's the founding law of this hall, 10,000 years old, and you built your treaty on it precisely because you knew that whatever you said aloud would bind harder than anything you signed. So say it. Say Sethanu. This whole assembly is waiting to hear which word you meant. He did not say it. That was the moment. Not a confession, not a collapse, not a villain's speech. Just a silence, 3 seconds long and then 4 and then 5, from a man who had never in his life been unable to find the next word. And in that silence the peace of the century came apart, quietly, the way everything in that hall of quiet things came apart. 11,000 delegates watched the finest negotiator in 300 years decline to speak a single word of a dead language, and understood, all at once, and without anyone having to say it, that the reason he would not speak it was that they had all just learned to hear it. Then the hall came apart loudly. It was Legate Soon Kor who broke first, and it was not rage. That was the thing Tamsin would remember, that it was not rage. The old vascular rose from the table of Concord, and the pale regrown chitin of that 40-year-old wound caught the aligned light, and Kor looked across the basalt ring at Marn for a long moment, and then turned, not to the thrall, but up 9 tiers, to the smallest and farthest seat in the hall, to the human girl who had stopped standing only because there was nothing left to say. And Legate Kor, who commanded the fleets of an empire who had spent a century at war, who would have disarmed forever out of pure literal honor, and handed a spiral arm to the people who had schemed to farm that honor like a crop, lowered the great scarred head in the gesture the vasquire gave to almost no one, and held it lowered, and the entire vasquire delegation, 900 worlds worth of warriors, rose and did the same. Arbiter Cale Vesson sealed nothing that day. The Treaty of the Meridian, the peace of the century, 10 years in the making, did not become one of the fundamental facts of the galaxy. It became, instead, the greatest scandal in the 10,000-year history of the Assembly of Concord, and the investigation that followed pulled the whole architecture into the light. The durative verb, the suborned master of roles whose 9 swift certifications for minor compact houses drew exactly the line Tamsin had said they would, the whole patient decade-long machine for conquering an empire with a lengthened vowel. Marn was recalled in disgrace. Sethan Olivar was stripped of 40 years' standing. And the human ministry, back on the small blue world at the edge of the Orion Spur, quietly unlocked a certain reclassified archive of Threll aristocratic correspondence and issued no statement about why it had ever been locked, because some cowardice is best survived by never mentioning it again. They did make peace in the end. It took another year, and it was uglier than Marn's beautiful fraud, full of hard clauses and mutual suspicion and inspection regimes with teeth. But every word of it meant exactly what it said, in all 4 languages, and the binding oath was rewritten in plain trade concordant that any delegate could read, and both empires spoke the same word and meant it, and the war of 103 years ended for real. It ended because it had been built, this time, by people who had learned in the Great Hall of the Meridian that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not a fleet. It was someone who was actually listening. They tried, of course, to make Tamsin Vey the story. The Assembly wanted to honor her. A dozen great powers wanted to hire her. The Threll, chastened, wanted to sponsor her studies, which she declined with a politeness that Reyes said was the most vicious thing she had ever heard a human do. But the honor Tamsin cared about had come in the first 10 seconds after the silence, up in the 9th tier, when the youngest person in the hall had understood that the room finally understood her back. Humanity was not expelled from the Assembly of Concord. Humanity was, by the end of that year, no longer probationary, and no longer in the 9th tier, and no longer boring, which Ambassador Reyes privately considered a catastrophe, because a galaxy that finds you boring will let you live, and a galaxy that finds you interesting will never leave you alone. When the great powers drew up the new peace, they asked, grudgingly, unanimously, that humanity stand as one of its guarantors, because after the Meridian no one, on any side, trusted a translation that a human had not read. The species that had been invited to fill a seat and witness a signing had become the one power the whole galaxy could not seal a treaty without, for the simple and unforgivable reason that humans, alone among them, had bothered to learn the languages everyone else agreed to stop understanding. They had invited humanity to watch. They had put the smallest thing in the room in the highest, farthest, most forgettable seat, and asked nothing of it but silence, and expected to be able to forget it was there. And on the morning the galaxy sealed the peace of the century, the smallest thing in the room had stood up, in a dead language, and made 11,000 of them hear the truth they had all agreed not to know, and every power at that table spent the rest of the age wishing, in the private cant of its own high houses, in the one register it was certain no stranger could understand, that it had never sent the invitation at all.